Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
I felt like I needed to begin to think of conversation as more than the words that my brain thinks of that then move through my lips. That I need to think of language, or I benefited from thinking of language as a whole experience. I keep going back to all of the visual and the sound and the smell, that all of that is really part of my language. And sometimes words are limiting. And if I am just forming words in my mind in response to someone else's words, I am missing such a huge part of the story and how I might connect with them.
In this episode of Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, we have the opportunity to listen carefully to Adaire, an end-of-life doula and chaplain. She helps people navigate through the most difficult parts in transitioning from life to death. We listen to how Adaire listens carefully to those who are moving on in their life, to their families, to the medical practitioners that surround the situation. The pace of this interview is a little bit slower than one you've heard before, and it's in keeping with the topic. Adaire uses incredible power of looking carefully into people without judgment and listening deeply to what they need to say, to make meaning and ultimately to make sense of the purpose of their life. I'm sure you'll be moved by this interview with Adaire.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening.
Every day we need to listen in environments that are not optimal for deep listening. Today, use this podcast as an opportunity to listen deeply in environments where the sound quality isn't ideal. Listening deeply to this podcast will be a great way for you to practice in environments where you might be distracted.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Bene ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
Our listeners may associate most commonly leaving life with the elderly. I'm sure there are times where you've dealt with situations, people much younger in life, with parents who felt the natural order was destroyed with their children passing before them. How do you listen then?
Well, grief comes in waves. And I have found through some personal experience as well as experience of those who have lost their children, the stories that they tell are a little different. There isn't as much a sense of completion. And it's as if they really want to offer a story that may have an ending or a meaning for why they were on Earth. And it's one of the harder times to listen because my heart is often open in a different way. And there is a lot of crying and a lot of anger and a lot of emotions that rise and fall like a hurricane might in the ocean. And to be able to be comfortable listening to the pain is really, really important. It's important for me not to piggyback onto their experience or to share my experiences. It's really important for me to be open and to develop a rapport pretty quickly. Holding space and being present and listening and not offering answers for them, but asking, can you tell me more about that? Offering them questions that leave doorways open for them to walk through if they choose.
Apart from tell me more about that, for our listeners, what are some of the other questions or possible techniques you're conscious of for yourself that keeps you present in the moment, maybe keeps you out of judgment and keeps them in a place that helps them to explore what they need to say much further?
Well, I try to be very intentional before I go into a room or a situation. I try to think of myself as a conduit, and that it isn't my job to make someone feel better because I don't know what that is for them. And I try to be very intentional and think of myself as a conduit or a blank slate, and that all I'm really doing is holding the words and the feelings and the emotions and the energy that this person needs to share. And I believe that when they share it, I try to pay really close attention to what it feels like, what the chair feels like that I'm sitting in order to bring myself into the present moment. This is where I am now. Sometimes I do some writing beforehand and say, it was a time when I was in this home. It was a time when I was with this person. It was a time when I was cold. So I try to get really in touch with all the senses that my body has the ability to listen and be present with, first of all. And I also remind myself that it isn't my job to take away this person's pain, and that they are going to offer me moments of their history and moments of their grief, and I hold it in a bowl of sorts. And when they are finished, and I just allow them to come to a completion, they'll tell me their body, they won't be breathing as quickly. The sweat that may be appearing on their skin will subside. They may reach for something to drink. And they take back what it is they need to take back. So I try to remind myself that if I try and take away what makes them seem uncomfortable, I would be taking away an area that they need to grow in. So in the moment that they share it with me, it's a gift that we are giving and receiving. And I need to really be able to remember that. But it takes some focus and some intention.
A lovely example of level one, listening to yourself first and setting the intention.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what happens with what's inside the bowl.
Well, it depends on what they take back. There are some portions of their story that they want to take back and repeat, and I believe it helps them integrate. It helps them make some kind of sense out of something that doesn't make sense. And there are fragments that I may walk away with that I then need to process in my own way, with my own tools, with my own mentors. I remember the first time in the hospital that I worked with a young boy who was brain dead, and his parents were out of town, and they had not told his parents that they were basically keeping him alive so that they could say goodbye to him. And I was given his clothes in the emergency room, and I waited to hear from them. They were about 2 hours away. And while I was looking in his clothes, there was a little note that said his parents had given him a list on how to do his laundry. And it was the first time he had moved away from home. And I just cried my eyes out. And I thought, oh my gosh, is this professional? Am I supposed to be doing this? And I realized that there is a level of feeling that it's okay for me personally to share with those that I am accompanying. So if there are tears, or if I move away with some of the thoughts and feelings that they've left in the bowl, that's the nature of giving and taking and listening and being present for me.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
With this story, what happened next when the parents arrived?
I walked with them from the emergency room up to the ICU, and I was the person that told them the condition of their son, who had had Crohn's disease, and he had stopped taking his medication, and that this family was very, very distinguished and very tailored and maintained and stoic, and there was a mother and a father and a 12-year-old brother. And when we got into the ICU unit, we spoke with the doctor, who basically told them that he was poisoned by his own body and that he was not alive. He didn't have any brain activity. And this family was apostolic. And in their faith, they believed that they were given the responsibility of the children in their lives until their God told them that now my relationship with your children is close enough and they are mature enough, and you no longer need to be responsible for them in that way. As this young man was moving more and more out of his body, as his body was starting its own process of dying, of being dead, there was some blood that came to the surface of his skin, and his mother was confused, but she wanted to remain near him. So I gave her a tissue and we blotted his face, and I took my cues from them, and I tried to be very aware of what they needed. And when they looked to me with a question in their eye, I asked permission to speak to them, and they ended up integrating what they felt was that he decided to stay in heaven with his grandmother, and that all was well, that somehow they had missed the cues that it was time for him to die. It was an incredible, I can still feel it now in my body. And that would be something that I would say I allowed myself to walk away with. And it was a gift in the form of a lesson and in the form of honoring someone in their own spiritual beliefs.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기.
Deep listening.
At the end of life, people often associate grief. Have there been situations that you remember as joyful?
Yeah, absolutely. I companioned a woman who was 50, at the top of her game, in her opinion, strategic planner for one of the most well-known hospital systems in the world. got a brain tumor, had a brain tumor, and I was with her 8 months. And the family was just fractured. There were lots of old resentments and lots of pain and lots of ex-husbands and mothers, and it was quite messy in that regard. But one of the most joyful moments happened after her transition. And about 3 months before she transitioned, I do sacred bathing and prepare bodies after death. And I offered this to her mother. And I had already spoken to the woman I was companioning. And so several days before it was apparent she was getting ready to transition, her mother came to me and asked if I would consider doing that with she and her sister. And I said, of course. And I assumed I would be facilitating this for the most part. I had lavender soap and I have things that I bring. And this family, about an hour after she died, and the mother and I went to start this ceremony, and her teenage boys approached and asked if they could help. Her sister, who she was very estranged with, asked if she could help, and her father came and requested to be part of this. And so I realized that my place was to just hold the space again, and I watched and I listened. And the father stood at the head of her bed, and I could sense that he wanted to be there, but wasn't really sure what options he had. And so I took a brush and a washcloth and held each of them out. And he took the brush, and so he brushed her hair, and her sister cleaned her feet, and her sons got a nightgown for her. And it was just the most healing and remarkable moment for the family. And if there could be joy in grief, I know that this woman would be experiencing the little bit of joy that the family was feeling along with the grief. And afterward, her mother wrote me a note and said, I never, ever could have anticipated walking away from her death with a memory that filled me with something other than dread.
You paint such a powerful image. I feel like I was in the room while that was happening. Adaire, in your work, I sense there's a number of situations where you play some kind of interpreter or negotiator role. I'm curious how you balance listening to those who are transitioning to their end of life and those who are staying behind. How do you listen simultaneously to the wishes of those who are the patients and those who are the families? And then finally, how do you integrate that, most often either with a medical or religious community that's part of the time you're spending with them?
That's a wonderful question. I have lots of thoughts and feelings associated with that and how best to answer it. I really strongly believe that it's impossible to step in the same river twice. And I have a deep trust in my ability to hold multiple feelings and emotions and thoughts at one time and be present holding them until the one that feels the strongest rises to the surface for me. Now, I've had lots of training as a hospital chaplain. We were a year in residency. We had 4 hours of individual group with these core chaplains every day. And I would take an example of a 5-minute interaction with a patient or a family member and break it down per sentence. So I would say, in my writing, I would say, Adaire chaplain says hello, patient 1 says hello. And I would break it down, and then we would create visual experiences in this same writing, minus the facts. So I've learned a lot of craft. I've learned a lot on how to separate some of those, but hold them to paint one picture. And then in this same therapy 4-hour group, we would take that and everybody would tear it apart and look at it and say, I think when you said this, you might have shut this person down. Or did you think about this interfering with them being able to say something? Or I think you got in the way. So there was a lot of that I've integrated into some of my techniques. But there's also a really, really deep trust in everyone's process. And even though it's not my death, it isn't my family. And so in a way, I need to move myself out of the way and be willing to be okay with not knowing, and being willing to listen, and being willing to say, I hear what you're saying, but I see something else. With your permission, would you like to know what I see? And I think that the bottom line for me always goes back to, it's my position to accompany or companion this family and this dying person. And depending on who asked me into the scenario, I try to be reverent in layers. Does that make sense?
Certainly it does. I'm curious to explore those layers.
Well, first and foremost, I resonate with the inner calling that I had from a young girl to companion those in end of life. And my grandfather was like Archie Bunker. And when he became ill, I had been walking around as a young girl thinking, not even cognitively, but there was something in me that thought, people are just not really saying what they mean. Or they're saying something, but they're showing me something else. I was really always aware of that. And when my grandfather became ill, it was like all these masks came down. And I said, oh, well, there he is. And so I believe that when people realize that their time is more limited, or that that they have a disease or an illness that's going to eventually end their lives, they offer more layers. And I think that I probably listen a lot with my eyes. And some of those layers are, what am I seeing that I'm not hearing? And what am I hearing that I'm not seeing? And some of those are layers that I have to trust my intuition And I have to trust my experience, and I have to trust my intention most of all. And believe me, there are times that I may see a family talking over someone who is near end of life, and they think they can't hear them, and they're saying things that are hurtful, in my opinion. I have to be able to hold that judgment and know what my place is, depending on how I have been invited into the situation once again.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Bene ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
Most of us spend about half of our day listening. Only 2% of us have been trained in how to do that. You're in a slightly different position where you've been trained, and you probably spend 80 to 90% of your time listening. What advice would you provide for people in a workplace about how they could become deeper listeners?
One of the first things that comes to mind is the idea that if we're not doing something, we're not productive. And so I often practice applying value to the act of being. I think that if we shift our focus from thinking that doing is the only way to learn or get something accomplished, that we will limit our ability to be present. Of course, there are wonderful techniques of meditation or breathing, learning to take breaks in between work or moving from the computer or taking more time for self, like not a 30-minute lunch. What about an hour lunch? And what about not being on the phone while you eat? For me, being able to leave and have a more balanced environment really helps me feel more whole. I also think about what are the ways in which I stop someone from finishing what they want to say. I also sometimes practice seeing other people as I think of other people as we are all one brain, and everyone else is a brain cell that makes up one brain. And if I am talking to them, I am not learning what they can give me. Everyone has their own little world. And sometimes I also practice seeing everyone in a cylinder, and they have their own world, 360 degrees around them, and how fascinating to be able to just observe that. So I do a lot of those kinds of practices naturally because I'm curious. And if the one that I like the most is practicing seeing other people as an extension of me that I can learn something about.
Do you have a story that matches that?
Well, I have two stories that match that. One is when I was quite young, and I used to work with a gentleman, and this was more about judgment. I used to help. I was in retail, and I was a floral designer for the first half of my life, and I helped a man every week, and he would come in, and I was very friendly with him, and I spoke easily with him, and he would be in tattered clothes with paint all over him. And then one day he showed up in a tuxedo in a Rolls Royce, And I was in my teens, really, and it totally floored me how blinded I had been to my own perceptions of who this man was on one little level. That stayed with me. And another one is I cared for a 35-year-old patient in the hospital once who had come in, who had been on a binge drink over the weekend, and they gave him fluids, and there were some things that happened in his brain, and he ended up being a lock-in where he was aware of everything that was going on around him, but he couldn't move, and he couldn't talk, and he couldn't blink. And I went and visited him every day, and I was trying to connect with him. And everybody was saying, oh, you don't have to do that. You don't have to worry about it. But I felt like that there was more there. And I just kept coming in every other day, and I would put my hand on his shoulder. And after a couple of weeks, I would come in and put my hand on his shoulder, and I would start to cry. And then one day, I realized that he could move his eyes, and he looked at me, and he was crying. And I realized that we had been connecting, but I had not seen that we were connecting.
What gift can the dying give the living about listening?
Healing isn't always about healing the body. And I have seen sometimes there is a presence and a sacredness that fills the room when someone is near end of life and transitioning and after they die. That is a feeling I only have at that time. And there are so many times that I have companioned people who I was present when they were sharing or listening to a family member go on and on and on about something, and the person left the room, and it was as if the dying person was able to see other facets of the relationship and the conversation, and they were so forgiving. And for me, sound is part of listening, but it's also visual, and it's a scent, and it's a way when my hand holds someone's hand who's transitioning, there is I hear them in a different way. And I believe that the dying speak in a different language when they're very close to death. And I almost want to say it feels like what I might think love is. Language is individual to the person using it. And what I associate with the meaning of cheese is or love or the color red is very different than what others associate. And if I needed, or I felt like I needed to begin to think of conversation as more than the words that my brain thinks of that then move through my lips, that I need to think of language, where I benefited from thinking of language as a whole experience. I keep going back to all of the visual and the sound and the smell, that all of that is really part of my language. And sometimes words are limiting. And if I am just forming words in my mind in response to someone else's words, I am missing such a huge part of the story. and how I might connect with them.
We have demonstrated beautifully why the title of the book, Deep Listening, has a subtitle called Impact Beyond Words. I love the way you described how you listen with your eyes and how you listen with your heart, and how important the smells are around you when you're listening as well. You've shared an extraordinary gift with our audience today, and for that I say thank you.
Thank you. It was really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Ku yingisela swinene.
Deep listening.
What a great privilege it was to listen to Adaire during the interview. She role models so many of the characteristics of deep listening: her depth and her breadth of listening, her ability to see both joy and grief in death. And as she talked about the way she listened to people who were transitioning, in her words, she taught me that listening is not just about your ears, but it's about your eyes, it's about your hands, it's about your mind, and it's about your heart. And as I was listening to Adaire saying that today, I was thinking, as you were listening to this recording, how deeply are you listening to those that you love? Are you listening completely? Or are you just listening with your ears? Or are you listening fully with your ears, your eyes, your hands, your mind, and your heart? Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening. Lourdes Lascelles.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Whakarongo Pohonu.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.